Approximately 90% of NPS NEPA is completed with CEs, so it's really important to understand how to properly use and apply CEs. This presentation explores the two basic types of CEs: Handbook Section 3.2 CEs, which do not require documentation, and Handbook Section 3.3 CEs, which require documentation. We'll finish the module by discussing programmatic CEs, CE adoption, public involvement, and red flags for using CEs, or when you might not want to use a CE. CEQ's former Associate Director for NEPA Oversight once said, "You have a CE for a reason. If a CE applies and no extraordinary circumstances exist, use them." The new 2020 CEQ regulations explicitly encourage the use of CEs where they are appropriate. CEs that do not require documentation come from two sources: the DOI regulations, which contain CEs for all of the Department of Interior bureaus, and the NPS chapter of the departmental manual. A through I, this is in section 3.2, A through I are from the DOI regs, and J through Y are NPS specific. These CEs typically have little or no environmental effect of any kind, let alone the potential for significant adverse impacts. If you look at this list, you'll see that many of these actions are routine and you don't really think about when you do them. They're just part of your daily work. Step one in applying this type of CE is confirming that the action is covered by one of the CEs listed. Your action may not be specifically listed in the text of the CE, but it should be a reasonable fit. The blue guidance in the handbook under each CE may be helpful in interpreting the actual text of the CE as well. The bottom line in applying CE text is that your application should be reasonable and rational, but it doesn't have to be overly restrictive. Once you've confirmed that there is a category of CE for your action, you must also confirm that none of the extraordinary circumstances apply. You can review page 40 of the NPS handbook for a list of the extraordinary circumstances. If an extraordinary circumstance applies, you should consider revising your proposed action in order to mitigate the impacts or address the impacts in some way so that the CE may be used. Note that many of the extraordinary circumstances use the word significant. The regulations are clear that you cannot use a CE if your action would have a significant environmental effect. Finally, if you think someone might be interested in the action later on, you may want to record the use of a CE that does not require documentation. 3.2E and H are examples of CEs that may benefit from documentation on a case-by-case basis. 3.2P, when the park is developing strategic plans or other broad plans, might be another example when you may wish to document a CE that you've used. Now, this is not CE documentation that we're going to talk about in a minute that's required for CEs that require documentation. This is simply recording somewhere that you thought about the action and that you're applying a CE that does not require documentation. This can be documented in a simple email or in a note to the project file, or you can use Pepsi to simply enter the description of the project and record the use of a non-documentable CE. So why would we do this? Well, it's because we might want to be able to prove that we applied a CE prior to taking an action. It would be a NEPA violation to take an action and then after the fact apply a CE if and when someone called us out for this process error. This is called a post hoc rationalization for the use of a CE, and NPS has actually been challenged on this issue in court at Cumberland Island National Seashore. In that case, the court found that the park could not show that it had categorically excluded the action prior to taking the action. The court wasn't looking for a justification of why the CE fit, which we'll talk about more in a minute, but they just wanted to see something in the record that showed that NPS had thought about and confirmed that the action fit a CE prior to taking the action. If you choose to document, it should not be considered to set a precedent for the need to document all future use of that CE at your park. Some final thoughts on these CEs. Keep in mind that for both CEs that don't require documentation and those that do, which we'll talk about in a minute, the proposal may trigger a need to comply with ESA, the Endangered Species Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, otherwise referred to as NHPA, and other laws. Because ESA Section 7 and NHPA Section 106 are independent statutory requirements, compliance with NEPA through a CE does not satisfy an agency's obligations under these laws. Consultations can help assist in determining whether you might trigger extraordinary circumstances related to significant impacts on these resources. Thus, when applicable, you must consult and document the consultation process if the proposal has a potential to affect listed species, critical habitat, or historic properties. Despite consultation, an adverse effect under Section 106 or likely to adversely affect determination under Section 7 may not necessarily trigger extraordinary circumstances or cause significant adverse effects under NEPA. So in some cases, you can still continue to use the CE. If you trigger these laws, you should develop a decision file for the CE and include documentation of how you satisfied these other requirements. Next, we'll talk about CEs that require documentation. From 2016 to 2021, approximately 30,000 NEPA reviews were completed in Pepsi using a 3.3 CE, or a CE that requires documentation. Really quickly, before we talk more about CEs requiring documentation, I'll review the CEs which are most commonly used in the Park Service. The most commonly used CE is that C4, which is for routine maintenance of historic structures. There were over 7,000 uses of that CE during that time frame. C3 is routine maintenance of non-historic structures. E5 is non-destructive data collection, inventory, etc. C5 is installation of signs, displays, and kiosks. C8 is replacement in kind of minor structures and facilities. And C18 is construction of minor structures. This just gives you an idea of the most common CEs that we use in the NPS. The steps listed below are from the NPS NEPA handbook. Before using a CE requiring documentation, you should consult with subject matter experts or an IDT to determine the proposed action, environmental issues, and potential environmental effects. If your park doesn't have an IDT process for evaluating actions subject to CEs requiring documentation, you should reach out to your REC and discuss ideas about how to create effective IDTs at your park. After you've identified the proposed action, you should confirm and prepare documentation that the proposed action fits within one of the CEs listed in 3.3 of the handbook and that none of the extraordinary circumstances apply. We're going to discuss what you should document in more detail on the next slide. However, generally it's important to remember that documentation should be as concise as possible, but will vary depending on the action. Typically, the greater the environmental impacts, the more in-depth the documentation should be. We recommend that you use the CE form to document the CE itself and use the environmental screening form on Pepsi or some other type of standalone analysis to document the impacts of your action. You should retain notes from internal scoping meetings, field notes, and documents in your decision file. And finally, you should use Pepsi to document your CE. If there's a potential for significant adverse effects, you cannot use a CE unless the proposal is modified to reduce those impacts. So let's quickly review how we will document a CE that requires documentation. You must be able to describe the action that you're proposing to take in enough detail that you can understand, one, whether the action fits within the definition of the CE or within the text of the CE, and two, whether the action is likely to trigger an extraordinary circumstance. In order to do this, you need to be able to describe the action and the nature of the action, including location, timing, materials, and other relevant information about the action. Next, you should be able to identify whether a CE applies. You can review the CE list and determine whether the action fits within the CE category, just like we discussed above. You should document which CE you are using. If an action fits within two potential CEs, we recommend that you pick one. You may also note that the action fits under another CE, but you do not need to document the same action under two CEs. Next, you must be able to describe how the action fits within the category of the CE on the CE form. In Pepsi, this is labeled CE justification. This is not a justification for why the park needs to take action or why the project is justified. It's a written explanation of why the action can be covered by the CE. When you're documenting in this section, you should pay close attention to language in CEs such as minor or minimal environmental impact or previously disturbed areas. Your justification should explain how your proposed action fits in these categories described in the CE. Finally, it's really important that we thoughtfully consider whether an extraordinary circumstance applies and document that thought process. In Pepsi, the extraordinary circumstances are listed with a yes or no option followed by an explanation section. It's important that you go beyond simply checking the no box for each extraordinary circumstance to indicate that it doesn't apply. We recommend that you add a sentence or two explaining why it does not apply. In some cases, it's appropriate to simply say there are no endangered species in the park, or no endangered species in the project area, or the proposed action does not have any effects on sacred sites. However, for some other resources and extraordinary circumstances, additional explanation may be necessary. If you're taking an action that does not have a significant effect, but it does have some real definable and tangible impacts, we recommend that you document those in your decision file. The ESF on Pepsi is the easiest place to document the environmental issues associated with your proposed action. The analysis should demonstrate that the impacts are not significant. And you can reference your supporting analysis in the ESF in the explanation section for the extraordinary circumstances. So you could, under an extraordinary circumstance, say, see the ESF for impacts and why there's no significant impact. Finally, CEs should be signed before taking action. The authority to sign a CE is delegated to the superintendent. We recommend using the CE form that's on Pepsi to document your CE. The CE can be digitally signed, but if for some reason you're using another form, you can make sure that the superintendent signs that form. Before moving on to programmatic CEs, I'd like to cover a couple pointers about using CEs generally. In the example on the screen, park staff wondered whether they could use a CE for installation of signs, displays, and kiosks for the installation of a solar-powered phone. There is no CE that discusses solar-powered phones. However, the action does not necessarily need to be called out in the CE, as we discussed earlier, but it must fit the category of actions. In this case, we consider not only the action, essentially the installation of a metal pole, but we also considered the impacts of the action and noted that the basic installation and the impacts were similar to installing signs, displays, and kiosks. Therefore, we determined that it was appropriate to use a CE for this action. Also, remember that the blue guidance under each CE in the NPS NEPA handbook is meant to be illustrative, not restrictive. So if your action isn't discussed in that, list under the CE. It doesn't mean you can't use that CE. You just must think about whether the action and the impacts are similar to those described in the CE. I'd like to shift gears for a minute and talk about programmatic CEs. These are CEs for ongoing and reoccurring actions in your park. There are likely many routine or ongoing actions related to park administration and particularly maintenance that are still subject to NEPA and may fall under a CE that requires documentation. To avoid preparing separate CE documents for each instance, which would be a lot of documentation, we encourage that you prepare a programmatic CE to cover multiple occurrences. Examples include spraying for invasive species, issuing special use permits, installing signs, and other types of maintenance activities. Some pointers, though, for maintenance. If you consider creating programmatic CEs that are consistent with the type of work performed. For example, if you're trying to cover maintenance for non-historic structures and historic structures, you should create two different programmatic CEs, one for non-historic maintenance and one for historic structure maintenance. The activities are different actions, have different impacts, and may have different consultation requirements. As with all CEs, you must consider extraordinary circumstances, cumulative impacts, and complete any other consultations that may be triggered. Talk with your RECs for examples of actions that other parks have created programmatic CEs for. Before moving on, a couple more tips on this. It's important to accurately describe the specific activities that are meant to be covered and any required conditions for the CE to apply. For example, timing restrictions on when the activity may take place or exactly where it will take place. Although a programmatic CE can be established to cover activities for a period of time, you should periodically review and update the CE as necessary. It's required that you review these CEs at least every 5 years to be consistent with the CEQ guidance. We recommend documenting to the extent practicable when you use a programmatic CE so that you can understand whether the action was accurately described and whether the analysis in the programmatic CE accurately reflects the impacts of the action. Your regional environmental coordinator may have tips for how this can be effectively done without imposing too much work or process on the park. The 2020 CEQ regulations now allow agencies to adopt another agency's CE in cases where the actions are substantially the same. This is new in the new regulations. We could not previously adopt another agency's CE. It's important to note what this provision does not allow you to do. This does not allow you to look at another agency's CE list and pick one of their CEs to use for your own action. This is adoption, and it's the same as adopting an agency's EA or EIS, only in this case, you're adopting their CE. There are two scenarios when you might be able to adopt another agency's CE. The first is when you and the other agency are working together on a project that requires you both to take an action. A common example is likely to be a road project through your park. In those cases, both you and Federal Highways likely have an action that requires NEPA analysis. The action is the same action in this case. In this case, if Federal Highways has a CE that covers the action, NPS likely would be able to adopt their CE if they chose to use a CE to cover the action. The second scenario requires more careful consideration and thought, and we recommend that you reach out to your REC or to EQD in this scenario. You might be able to adopt another agency's CE when that agency is taking an action, taking the same or similar action that you want to take, but you're not necessarily working together on the project. For example, if BLM is taking an action to control an invasive species and they're using a CE for the action, you might be able to adopt their CE if you're taking the same action. There's caveats to this. You would need to be controlling the same species with the same mechanism. Be careful under this scenario. Finally, you must document your adoption of another agency's CE. This requires documenting many of the same things you would for a documented CE. You must describe the action and how it fits within the CE. You must document that none of the NPS extraordinary circumstances apply, and you must have information about the impacts to support the extraordinary circumstances findings. An additional requirement for adoption is that you must be able to demonstrate that your action is substantially the same as the other agency's action. This is essential to demonstrating that the adoption is appropriate. You can adopt another agency's CE on Pepsi. Instead of choosing an NPS CE in the drop-down list of CEs, choose adoption. And before signing a CE, adopting another agency's CE, make sure all other compliance is complete. We strongly recommend you reaching out to your REC to discuss CE adoption and reviewing the interim guidance for preparing CE documentation before you attempt to complete this for the first time. A couple thoughts about public involvement. Public comment is not required for a CE, but it can be helpful. Public input can help identify environmental issues and provide additional information from stakeholders. You may also want to take public and agency comment if you aren't sure whether an extraordinary circumstance would apply. Generally, we would suggest a short public comment period. Section 106 also has a public involvement requirement, so if your proposed action is the type of undertaking with potential to affect historic properties, you may also have to conduct public involvement to meet those separate requirements. There's no corresponding requirement under Section 7. However, if you do need formal consultation, the NPS NEPA handbook does encourage sharing a draft of the accompanying biological assessment and resulting biological opinion with your NEPA documentation. The bottom line is that you will need to document these processes and share relevant information when applicable, even for CEs for which no formal documentation is required. Some parks have chosen to notify the public of all of their approved CEs by posting a quarterly or biannual list of CEs on the park or project website by a Pepsi. For example, Yosemite posts all of their completed CE packages on Pepsi. In part, this is done to avoid FOIA requests for completed CEs. That said, this can draw attention to the action, so be prepared with a consistent process, including a plan to respond to public inquiries if you have them. I'd like to end with some red flags for using CEs. If you're relying on extensive mitigation to justify the use of a CE, you must make sure you commit to implementing the mitigation. And if you can't implement the mitigation, either you don't have the funding or the staff, you will need to modify the action or complete an EA or an EIS. Whether or not you can use 2 or more CEs for an action is related to whether an agency depends on the independent utility test. That is, could the action have reasonably taken place independent of the other action? Generally, we would say if an action requires 2 or more categories from the CE list to cover the action, you probably should not be using a CE. For example, if you're constructing a pit toilet, that's probably CEable. But if that pit toilet is actually part of an expanded campground, it's part of a larger project that may not fit under a single CE. In that case, excluding the pit toilet from the larger project would improperly segment the action because it's connected to a larger project. The bottom line is that connected actions must be analyzed in one single NEPA review. whereas similar actions, which have independent utility or could happen without the other, don't have to be analyzed in the same NEPA review. If you find yourself in a situation where you have a lot of different actions, you may wish to consult your REC to make sure that you do not improperly segment your NEPA review. In conclusion, if you have questions about how to apply CEs, we recommend that you consult with your regional environmental coordinator for more direction, and be sure to read the NPS NEPA handbook and supplemental guidance for using CEs.